I'm Carolyn, and I'm here with Patricia, and we are here to share some of our instructional decisions around the dilemmas and considerations we had when planning read-alouds in science. And so we'll be using an example today to ground our conversation in a book that we've both used with students called We Are Water Protectors. And so we'll just start out with some big picture thinking that we've been from conversations we've been having about how to use read alouds and what books to choose and those things. And then we'll share some specifics about the plans we made.
Here I am with the book We Are Water Protectors, Somos Guardianes del Agua en español. And read-alouds really support bringing students prior languages and literacy practices as important ways to supporting science ideas. But we're also thinking about bringing books that could support these ideas in languages other than English, in this case, Spanish.
Yes. And I think people watching or sharing with us might notice that these books are not like you wouldn't look at this and say, oh, that's a nonfiction book. It is definitely a true story and a true effort, but it is not what people might say, oh, photographs, nonfiction, facts about water, even though the story is there. So one thing that we've been thinking about is doing text sets that blend a variety of genres, not only languages, but also a variety of genres to really kind of humanize the stories. Because yes, nonfiction books traditionally have lots of information. They might answer kids' questions. Kids might be excited to read it once they have their questions out. They're like, oh yeah, I want to find out about this or that, or let's read this page together as a class. But often they're written in a passive voice, which is hard to understand. Most don't have humans as part of the nonfiction text, like it teaches about life cycles or ecosystems, but human as observer rather than as a part of it. And so one of the things that I appreciated in particular about this book, but also similar genres of this either narrative nonfiction or even fiction stories that have science elements in them, is that humanizing factor.
Yeah, another important aspect of bringing these stories or a book like We Are Water Protectors is that also allow us to bring different ways of knowing. In this case, for example, bringing indigenous knowledge, that we really attend to that science ideas that our students might bring from their families or the cultural ways of being. So that's an important to really reshift the culture of elementary science.
Yeah, and Patricia, do you have any other additions to make about using books other in languages other than English?
Well, yeah, so the books of in languages other than English is really an important way of bringing translanguaging pedagogies to our elementary science classroom. This is the way that can be strategically used to position students who might speak languages other than English as students who already have some important knowledge to share and to expand their scientific ideas. So bringing books with the science ideas behind in language other than English can support eliciting those ideas, recognize that that knowledge is there, and look for ways that the students can expand their ideas through using all their linguistic and cultural repertoires.
Yeah, and I think there are more and more books coming out that have both like the Spanish and English on the same page. So we'll talk about grouping in a little bit, but like if you're having students read together, you could go with students that speak the same language reading in their language, or students learning English reading in a group with students who speak English more comfortably, but that they have their language access and then they can teach. Like I feel like there's a lot of resources that we can use for this. I just also really
Yeah,
like that point about disrupting that power too, of like English doesn't hold the power, like the knowledge is the power, and we can build that together. Yeah.
yeah, and it also supports, particularly in classroom where students are targeting both language, in this case,
Oh,
English and Spanish, to really think about metalinguistic awareness and how we can expand the ways of knowing and bringing knowledge to science when we can look at how do you might say something, an idea in English versus in Spanish, and that can be sometimes similar or different. And that expands the repertoire, but also the discourse of the science ideas within the classroom.
absolutely. So now that we've talked about the language piece with words a bit, the notion of picture walks is really important, particularly with picture books. You can do read alouds with chapter books, but in this case, I think we're thinking mostly about the books with beautiful illustrations or photographs. And so let's just think a little bit together about like, what is a picture walk? Why use it? What happens in older grades, like by not using it or using it? And like, what are some ways you engage with picture walks?
Yeah, well, for me, walks are really an important and key element of supporting, in this case, scientific sense making. We often believe that picture walks are only a support for early students who might not yet have the language, but I believe that picture walks is an important literacy practice for any students. It's also a way through which students can, just at looking at pictures, bring their own interpretation of what is happening in the store, share the interpretations with others, and also use different features of a book, not just the text, to make meaning. And I think that's also supports uh, equalizing the knowledge that exists. Some students might know how to decode a word, but my other students might just make sense of just of the picture.
Yeah, and I think also the illustrator gets to make some intentional choices too. So I appreciate picture walks in addition to the reasons you've mentioned too, but just to see how the illustrator interprets the text to represent it. And with some books, they sneak like little modeling elements in there, like arrows or symbols or graphics that represent things that people don't directly observe, but are showing us either part of the problem, like in the book we're talking about today with the pollution, and the human impacts on water sources, but that those are in there that actually may not be fully developed in the text either. So sometimes the illustration actually says more than the text, which I think can be really powerful in terms of like that art lens of like how are you telling a story. And in primary too, like do your pictures match your words is something that I've heard, here in ELA classrooms. But it's like sometimes your picture can tell more than your words too.
Absolutely. And pictures also can be a really important source for critical thinking. I like how you mentioned the idea of intentionality between a symbol and also asking students, why is that there? What do you think it represents for whom? Sometimes pictures might represent the reality of a particular cultural group or an age, and another person who comes from a different cultural background might have a total different interpretation of that picture. And so those are important ways of early on creating critical thinking for students through what we and open conversations about what we interpret from pictures.
Well, and I think that kind of leads us into the next thing we wanted to share and talk through, which was like who is doing the reading. So like with read alouds, often it's the teacher facilitating and the kids are in a whole group opportunity. Maybe there's some turn in talks, some whole class discussion. But I think there's also opportunities for partner reading, strategic grouping, the teacher getting us started, and then giving copies of the books or pages from the books, depending on the book, that kind of thing. So just what are you thinking about with the who is doing the reading part of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like you said, I agree that one important part of, for example, for teachers modeling of who is doing the reading is starting with, for example, a think aloud, looking at a title, looking at a picture, and really opening up that idea of what we are thinking out loud when we look at that. And that supports modeling for students. Interpretation. Students might have, like I said before, different interpretations, but there I am visually modeling for students how to do that think aloud, and then really support that release of responsibility when are now students between pairs or small group can have a sense of looking at a picture, looking at the illustrations in the text, and also do that think aloud and negotiate the understanding of that picture or that part of the book.
Yeah, that was also making me think of like modeling silence and think time. So like when we put the cover of the book up there, not just trying to, there's so many things to manage when we are working with teachers or when we are being the teacher in a classroom, like trying to move through it and just recognizing like taking that minute to really look carefully and giving kids that minute to process and see and then talk with each other. And then hopefully that's something that then when they go to read with a partner, they give each other that time to think too, because I sometimes think we rush through our days a little bit, and that just slowing down to really give the attention to the book and the author's message is an opportunity. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah, or to alternative interpretations of what the story might think.
right. So thinking
Uh,
about like who you call on first, like, is that student have a lot of social capital or academic capital in the classroom that actually calling on that person first might shut down someone else from wanting to share. So I think that's why I tend to go for turn and talks, and then you turn and talk with your other neighbor, right? Like you just have like carpet spots and those kind of management things. But I also was thinking about like the book opportunities and how making copies is more available now than it was before. And so like taking, a book or part of a book out and like having pages around the room or copies of different pages with different groups. And maybe this isn't the book for that, but some books could lend themselves to, once you read a page together, getting kids up and around to talk and read together is an opportunity. So I guess I'm just interested in the, when do we do a read aloud like we were trained to do them, and when can we kind of break the mold a little bit in service of kids interacting more with each other around the texts, and
Yeah,
discussion.
yeah, I think that's a great point of thinking of the importance of bringing the interdisciplinary areas of language, literacy, and science together, and really acknowledge how the three are always connecting to support students in making sense. I really appreciate how you mentioned that usually we tend to use think alouds or read alouds just as an initial
Mm.
input for a story, but what we are proposing here is really use a read aloud, in this case, a unique text that has been intentionally used or chosen to really support the deepening of the scientific ideas that you're trying to develop in your students, and how, in my opinion, a think aloud should be used not only at the beginning, but maybe at the middle of the unit or at the end, and really compare to what we learned from experiments from other texts, and how we were able to deepen our knowledge of the ideas that we're trying to develop in our students.
And I was also thinking too about just the genre. Like if we do a text set of different genres, like I can approach a nonfiction, like National Geographic book on water supply around the world in a different way than I would the We Are Water Protectors story. And so modeling that for students too is a think aloud, like,
Um,
wait, what kind of book is this? Is this a book I can just read a chapter out of and get some information, or do I need to read it from start to finish? Is it more of a, like where? So just that awareness too, I think, is something that students being more comfortable approaching different types of text can be an opportunity too.
yeah, and teachers using different kinds of text with unique purpose. For example, one type of text might be used to really deepening the elements of knowing of water sources, for example. Another text might be to think critically about who has access to water. And so those are two equally important within a justice-oriented framing of science knowledge.
Absolutely. So I think we've done enough talking. Let's get to our plan. So we're going to just share a little bit about the different ways that we chose to use the same book. And so in like what pause points we chose and why, because I think one thing that can happen with read alouds is that there are so many opportunities to pause and have kids discuss. So it's kind of like when and why and how many, I think, was something that we're both thinking about in our plans. So Patricia, would you like to go first with your third grade plan for a life
Sure,
science unit? Okay.
absolutely. So as I mentioned, I use the book We Are Water Protectors, or Somos Protectores del Agua. And I use this book, I chose this book to really support, as you mentioned, a unit on life cycle, but also to support students um, in both dual language and English only classrooms. The goal is to help students develop critical consciousness about issues that might affect diverse communities. In this case, the value of water for a particular community, and also interrogate who might have access or not to water. Um, as we mentioned, it was part of the life science unit. Um, and looking at the interrelationship and bringing multiple ways of understanding and knowing the world. So some of the standards we use specifically were related to Common Core standards, where students will see and will be able to develop skills to make a claim about the solution to a problem, or determine the meaning of words and phrases, in this case, how the author is using what water means for the community in which the story is happening.
Yeah, and then on for my use of the book, we read the book in English in a fifth grade classroom in an earth science unit looking, it was around the NGSS standards around water availability on Earth, and different ways that individual communities use science ideas to protect the Earth's resources and the environment. And then similar to Patricia's plan, we also did the parts of the stories and poems about figurative language and bringing that out and metaphor. Um, so thinking about that as a way to communicate what kinds of damage can happen to an ecosystem or a water source in this case. And so when we used it, it was in a unit in fifth grade called like Water as a Resource, and it's part of their argument and advocacy unit in English language arts. So they were starting to research different water issues around the world. And this was one way we brought it together as an example as the class.
Our plan was really honing into the literacy aspect and language aspect of developing, for example, a claim or understanding figurative language. In this case, as I mentioned before, the importance of water for this community. So our key objectives are that students will be able to identify the literal and figurative meaning of 1 to 3 words, but they were also going to be able to identify how the author is making a claim that is supported by naming relevant evidence through a variety of either clause structures or correct and combination of ideas. So this is to target both how we can support students in developing their claims in science, but based or through an example of a unique book that does that as a model. We also started with really eliciting the students' ideas by having them look at a picture in which they would really try to unpack what is a pipe, how is it being used, and what effects could have in a community, just to bring current but also prior knowledge and experience of a students or not, who might not identify with how a pipeline is constructed and what are the pros and cons of such an engineering process for a particular community.
That we both chose to really pause on this cover in both the third and fifth grade plans and like really ask students like what did they notice, like really look at the details of the illustration, like the people holding hands, the moon in the background, a woman in the front like standing in a certain way, and what the title means and what they think that will mean, given that we've in our class we watched the video, with your class you looked at those photos, but that's just kind of getting them into what that means. And at least in my lesson plan, we didn't really define protector because the discussion among students was like close enough that I didn't feel like I needed to belabor that point, because they're going to get more information as we read to clarify that understanding. And then I chose not to do a picture walk and just jump into reading. But Patricia, you had a picture walk in your plan. So again, what were you hoping that they noticed?
Yeah, so an important part of the picture walk, like I mentioned before, is because strategically a picture walk could support translanguaging, where students might be, in this case, grouped by their common home languages, in which they could start making sense of what is happening in the story in the language of their choice. And that would support students bringing their funds of knowledge, but also creating meaning collectively about a story that then we're all going to read. So really strategically supporting sense making in the language of the choice of the students, but also through bringing in the new ways of being and the cultural knowledge that this book presents, which is in this case, indigenous knowledge and the value of water for indigenous communities.
Yeah, I'm kind of rethinking my choice there too of like, why don't I do picture walks as much with older students? And I probably should. So yeah, then I think we both had a few points that we chose, and they were similar, like the river's rhythm runs through my veins, like that metaphoric language of like, yes, there's water in our bodies and that's important, but what does it mean to be a rhythm? What does that really get at? Why is that different than just saying I need water to live? Like that would be a very similar way of saying the same thing, but what's that figurative language piece do? And this metaphor of the black snake and pausing on those pages. I think in my plan, we kept the kids together like whole group as fifth grade students, like watching us read, turn and talk with people at your table group, look back at the projected book together as the whole book. But it looks like in your plan, you have some opportunities to have it start whole group and then work in partners and groups. Would you say a little bit about your plan there?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of that strategic idea was to really do within literacy what we call a release of responsibility. So have a students first see how the teacher reads part of a book, look at the pictures, and try to do a think aloud of what does she or he think might be happening. And with that, give the students then the chance with the you do, we do, to now with a partner or two grab another page of the book and really do the same. So really think together what might be happening, who are these characters, how the story is unfolding, who are some of the characters and how they might be related to water or to what water means for the characters. And then for later on, for students, and this is where a more heavy emphasis in language and literacy practice is to really hone in into one page and see how the author is supporting the claims with evidence from the text.
Also having copies of the pages, like kids can sticky note on them and kind of mark them up to make their claim about the author's claims, and then foster that discussion as having a thing to point to and refer to. And so everyone can kind of track a conversation better. I always find with having a visual, like, no, this is the part I'm talking about, right? Um, yeah. And
Yeah,
then
and that also supports that, for example, now with the possibilities of having this book through videos or
Mhm.
having the chance of finding, for example, a family who might translate it to what the book says to another language, we are able to both support language but also sense making and making it accessible to different ways of learning and different language learners that you might have in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, back to that like decentering English, but centering this knowledge building together as a goal for this. And then I think we both had some plans like after reading, like we'd have some different pause points that I have on the screen, you know. And then after reading, I think we both went for a quick write of sorts and then a bit of a discussion. So, like, quick write just to give students some silent processing time because they've been doing a lot of cognitive work with their partners or their groups or their class. So this gives them some individual think time. And it could be about a question like, what does it mean to be a water protector? Or what connections did you make between, in my case, between the story and the video, in your case, between the story and the pictures with it they looked at before reading. And then also a question about like, how does what we've learned support our work related to communities, justice or power or our future, like this idea of influence on the environment, and that would set them up for having a bit of a discussion, and then they could go back and add more to their writing. Because I know we've been talking about like it's not which is first. It's like sometimes a jot first helps with the discussion, but then that gives you more things to write about. So it's kind of like this nice supportive cycle. But again, I think both of us were really getting at that point of like how our communities and members of communities of any age really working to protect their resources and create a sustainable place that we all live at. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that we both really have the goal of honing in into how these tools can support really creating a critical consciousness about the role that we have as members of any community in supporting, like you mentioned, that sustainability. Could be through being conscious about how we use water in this case, or how we are using electricity. And so we both end up with a writing up opportunity for students to look at a picture and see how is that picture in this case representative of the work that a community can do to sustain their resources
Or that,
and to.
yeah, that one community influences another. So someone makes a decision and doesn't live in that place. You think about government, legislature. So I just feel like also with this book, there's some great social studies connections too to pull in as like who gets to have the power to make decisions that then other communities have to live with or respond to or can protest. Like I just think that that's a nice opportunity to think about like how using those science ideas um, to advocate um, for,
Absolutely,
yeah.
and to make visible that this critical that consciousness rising can happen as early as in elementary school. That the students are able to empathize with the needs of others or their own community, and that's important that that work and that agency starts in elementary school.
Yeah, and the power of like using diverse sets of genre for read alouds can open that door for students. So any other final thoughts about read alouds, choosing texts?
Um, No, I think that for me, really thinking about the intentions of what, first of all, with what purpose I'm using a text, um, who is going to be my audience, and what are some of the key stopping points in that text. I think that is it's always important to make sure that before we present a text to students, that we do as teachers that prior planning of really thinking strategically to combine what we really want to get out of the text, but also possibility for students to shifting where the reading of the sense making that they do of that source.
Yeah, I think that's especially if you are, at a school that has some books that you share with your teammates. This doesn't have it in this particular book I have, but just on the inside cover, like leaving a sticky note with a plan of like, oh, I stopped on pages 7, 9, and 11 and asked these things, or leaving the pages sticky noted. That doesn't take away the planning that we all would love to do all of the time in all of the subject areas, but it can help someone who's like, ooh, let me quick look through, but it's like, wait, what is my goal? Okay, which pause points will I use and which might I skip depending on what the other teacher did. I just think, yeah, that's so important to take that minute. And like you said earlier, a lot of these books are now on YouTube or recording. So sometimes I like listen to it while I'm finishing something and then I'm like, oh wait, I need to stop there and there because that goes with my goal. And also just revisiting texts, like leaving these out. I'm sure, elementary teachers do that all the time. You leave it on your ledge during independent reading time. Kids might grab this book to reread it on their own. Um, and yeah.
But with that promoting that, I like what you said about the rereading because it's important to reinstate in students that every time we read a book, even if it's the same book, we get out something different out of it. And sometimes we tend to think that one time we read the book is done. And no, this is a way in that we, through our intentional plan, how one same book can be used for very different purposes or goals. And that we need to share that with the students too,
Yeah, and I
and
think
with
that's
other
just a good
teachers.
planning question of like, is this week a time for me to read 3 different books in my read aloud, or is it a time to do 2 different books and the third day we actually revisit one of the two, or we look at them side by side in my week because just adding more things to our lists as teachers, right? Um, okay, well, we hope that you found some of our conversation helpful in intentionally planning for read alouds in science, and you should have seen some of the screen grabs, and I'll have some links in the description below to link to some of the resources we referenced.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.